Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, which is called Stress, Resilience and Mental Health. I have to say before we start, you've actually broken a record for Care First by joining this webinar today. We have 746 people actually registered. So I'm going to go through the webinar with you now, and I have a colleague who's waiting in the wings here to help with the questions and answers. I hope Mental Health Week is going well for you and that you've all benefited from the 3 previous webinars that we've run for you this week. We're going to make a start now, and if you have any questions, please hold them until the end, and then we can do the questions and answers at the end. So when we used to talk about stress, people used to ask, what do you mean by stress? And I think that's such a good question. What do we mean when we talk about stress? So, what does that word mean to you? Imagine that you didn't have language as your currency, and I said to you, draw a picture. Now, don't panic, I'm not going to ask you to draw, although at the moment no one could see that. But if I were to say that language wasn't your currency and you had to come up with an image of what stress meant to you, I wonder what it might look like. Just think about it for a minute and think, if you had to draw a picture or come up with an image, what might it be? What does stress look like for you? Now at Care First, we've delivered a very similar webinar to this over the last few years, and I can tell you that it's not unusual for very few people to come up with the same image. And the purpose of asking the question is not just to see how well you can imagine or how well you can draw, but to demonstrate that one size does not fit all when it comes to stress. Stress means different things to different people. And depending on where you are, what your resilience is like, how you manage things, stress, again, will look different and feel different. There's no right or wrong answer to this. Stress represents the way we're feeling sometimes when our emotions are running too high and we feel we have too much to do. But I wonder what your image is and what your image means to you. There's a great dictionary definition here that calls it a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. Now, interestingly, before the 90s, we didn't actually use stress as a word to describe any sort of emotional issue. Stress tended to be used in the building trade in terms of buildings or perhaps bridges, or in the medical field when they talked about a stress fracture. And I think the analogy for that is when too much is placed upon it, it can bend, break, or crack. And I think that's a fantastic description of what stress is like. When there is too much placed upon us, we could bend, break, or crack. And before the 90s, as I said, we didn't use stress in terms of an emotional issue. It was more to do with building or something medical. And after the Walker versus Northumberland case, which you can read about in the article and access the information for yourself, Mr. Walker was able to prove that his local authority were in breach of their duty of care, in that they failed to protect him from the impact of too much work, too big a workload, a large area geographically he was covering, and he was managing a team whilst carrying his own caseload. And he repeatedly asked for help, and this help wasn't forthcoming. And after that ruling, health and safety executives seemed to think, hang on a minute, it's not enough to provide hard hats and safe shoes and no trailing electricity wires. We now have to look after not just people's physical well-being in the workplace, but their emotional well-being. And thereafter, stress became a word that we use quite a lot. And I want to ask you, following this webinar and going forward, do you use the word appropriately? Now think about that, because I hear people saying things like, oh, the journey was stressful, the weather is stressful, the relationship is stressful. What we're actually describing may not be actual stress, but it could be that it's normal day-to-day pressure. And I think because we use the word all the time, it doesn't have quite the importance that it used to. At one time, if you mentioned emotional stress, people really listened because they thought, goodness me, this is a serious thing. Now, because we've overused the word, people perhaps don't see it in the same way. In fact, I was talking to my grandson a while ago about school and things in the days when people were going to school before lockdown. And I said to him, how is it in the classroom? And he said, you know what? It's a bit stressy. And I thought, how does he know what it is? He's 7. How would he know that? But he'd heard it and he related it to having too much work and too many people around him. And so for him, it was stressy. So I think that's interesting that a 7-year-old had learned that by people talking to him, people around him. So thinking about the issue is, why is it so prominent, not just at work, but in life generally? Well, in the workplace, it's serious because people can talk about stress in a very negative way, and it can actually raise concerns for the organization. It can raise concerns about people's competence. It can raise all sorts of concerns. So we do have to be very mindful of using it appropriately in the workplace. And in life generally, I wonder what we mean. What do we mean when we talk about stress in life generally? What's good about raised awareness, particularly in a mental health awareness week such as this, is that it raises the awareness of the word, of the condition, of the illness, or whatever the subject is. And the more people talk about feeling under pressure or feeling stressed, the more organizations become aware of it and become more able to help individuals and organizations also. The negative connotations are because people use it, as I've already said, sometimes inappropriately. You know, it might be stressful setting up a webinar, but in actual fact, it's a bit of pressure. Yeah. So I think we have to try and distinguish between stress and pressure. The differentiate between it is that pressure, and you might say, well, actually, it's the same as stress. But what we're talking about is stress when it becomes an emotional illness, and pressure, the day-to-day stuff. So think about what life would look like and be like with no pressure. Now, prior to lockdown, and when we were doing these sessions, running these sessions, I used to ask that question, and people would say, oh, I love to spend more time without my mobile phone and the laptops and the computers. I would love to spend more time with my family. I would love life to be quieter, for there to be less traffic on the road. And I'm really interested in that question today, because have we achieved less pressure? And I think that's a question that I personally can't answer, but I'd like to leave with you and say, before lockdown, those were the sorts of answers I was getting to that question. Now, during lockdown, I'm wondering what life would look like if we had no pressure. Would it be different? So the impact of stress can be felt several ways. It can be felt physically, the way we feel. Our physical illnesses could be manifest because of stress. Our mental ability, our cognitive and our behavioral things are all affected by stress. Too much put upon it causes it to bend, break or crack. Now, when you look at this, don't think, oh my goodness, that's me, I've got all of them. The chances are, under pressure, we sometimes get some of them. Yeah, but it could also be the result of a physical illness that causes us to experience those things. So don't suddenly think, oh goodness, that's me, I've got all of those. But people who are more predisposed to having a stressful, as they see it, life, or a heavily pressured life, are perhaps more inclined to experience those problems. We move on to the mental and cognitive, that loss of concentration. How many of you have gone into a room to collect something and forgotten what you've gone into the room for when you're under pressure? It's a bit like that, what's the description now? The rabbit in the headlights. You just don't know what to do. You feel frozen. And we all know about fight and flight, but what about freeze? Sometimes when we're severely overwhelmed, we feel that we can't make a decision. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. We sometimes experience confusion and certainly a loss of concentration. And one that isn't there, but I always mean to put there, is also clumsiness. I don't know how many of you, when you're under pressure, get quite clumsy, knock things over. I don't know. I'm just asking the question because in the past, many people have said, actually, sometimes when I'm under so much pressure, I also get very clumsy. Then we look at behavioural and some of the feelings around this, and people can perhaps be more anxious than normal when they're under extreme pressure, or again, let's call it stress for now. Depressed, lethargic. Some people sleep all the time. Some people, though, the opposite of that, are very hyped up and can't sleep at all. Often people become tearful or irritable. Think of how you react to it. And I think any managers listening, this is a really good question, because think of the people in your team and all of you think of yourselves as individuals, when you're under pressure, when you're feeling stressed, how do you actually behave? What do you do? Now, it could be that your behavior changes in such a way that other people will notice. But it could be you're someone who goes for a run when you're feeling under pressure, or plays a sport, or does something that other people won't necessarily see. So that's one of the good things about raising awareness, is helping you talk about it, because not everybody displays symptomatic behavioral type things when they're under pressure. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. So what do you do when you're stressed? What do you do? How do you behave? Is your behavior so obvious that other people around you will know, or is it something that you do and manage by yourself? That's why, if you are struggling with this, always talk to a manager or a team leader and say, I'm struggling with this and this is what it is. And hopefully you'll get that help and support that you need. So what are some of those pressures from external and internal factors? Now, I've done 2 slides for this. The one looks at it before lockdown. So we've got the workload. Often people say, oh, the workload is far too high. We've got the people around us, our managers, colleagues, or perhaps if you're working in a hospital setting, patients. The working conditions, poor working conditions really cause people to feel unhappy. Too high expectations of ourselves. Are you the sort of person who doesn't delegate? Are you the sort of person who says, oh, give it to me, I'll do it? Do think that, you know, that could be adding to your pressure. Try to delegate more, I guess. Perfectionist tendencies. Oh, no one can do this as well as me. I've often heard that say, give it to me, I'll do it. I can do this better. So we get into that mindset that we're the only ones that can do something. And because of that, we put more pressure on ourselves. And sometimes when we're under pressure or we're experiencing emotional stress, we're not able physically or emotionally to ask for help or support. And sometimes we're afraid to ask because we'll be seen perhaps as weak, or we won't get a promotion, or any of those things might come into play when it comes to stress. So be mindful of that. And also, sometimes we can't ask for help because we have such a low level of assertiveness. Now, when I talk about pressure from external and internal factors during lockdown, I think it might be a bit different. I think we'll still get workload, distractions. If you're working from home, you're maybe working in your kitchen table, you may be working somewhere in the house where you have family around you. It might be more easy to be distracted. Anxiety about taking breaks. Do you feel anxious when you think, oh, I'm just going to have a cup of coffee? Because someone might be checking up on me. There is a degree of anxiety around that. You know, what if someone calls while I'm just going to the bathroom? Well, that would happen in the workplace, but because people can see you, they know what's going on. Whereas working from home, I think it's increased many people's anxieties about taking breaks. More to prove. I'm going to be on my laptop from this time in the morning till that time in the evening. And because I'm there and I'm working, I'm proving that I'm working. So again, we're putting pressure on ourselves. Struggling with technology. Goodness me, this was a massive struggle for many people when they were suddenly told that they were working from home. You know, many people didn't have their own laptops, for example. We had to learn new ways of working, new ways of keeping in touch, struggling with the technology around all of it. And that for some, again, has created a massive pressure. Also, again, because sometimes the assertiveness level is low, you don't want to ask for help for fear of feeling stupid. And as I said there, you might be anxious about asking for help. You might also feel alone and disconnected, particularly obviously during lockdown. I know you may have a meeting with your team members. I know that that's a high possibility, but just having those sort of office chats that we have, albeit briefly when you're making a coffee or something, that isn't actually happening now. We're out here, many people on their own, many people with family, but you do feel a bit alone and disconnected because of lockdown and because you can't be seen to be working. You're not with your colleagues. So in finishing the bit on stress, really, we need to look at stress and what it means to us. So if we imagine a bath, all the pressures that we have in our life is the water cascading into that bath. So we've got things like home, family, friends, technology, finance, health, all of those things, all of those issues are going in quickly into that bath. Now, if we're quite resilient, we can hold quite a lot of that. So that bath is directly related to our resilience or our level of vulnerability. So if we're okay, we've got a big enough bath to cope with everything in it. If we're not okay, that bath somehow becomes smaller and doesn't have the capacity to hold the stuff that's going into it. So think for a minute about the stuff that has to be going on to let out some of the things that are in it. Yeah, and turn off those taps. Well, the healthy things would be healthy eating, drinking, keeping hydrated appropriately, taking exercise, doing something to keep our minds active, communicating with people, talking about what we feel and not just passing the time of day. Those things are really good at letting out some of that stuff, some of that stress from the bath. The opposite also. Sometimes we don't want to do that and we think, I know, I'll have a drink of alcohol, that's going to make me feel better. Well, one night you might have a glass of wine and that's fine. But the next night you might have to have another second glass, and the third night you might be having 3 glasses, because you're going to need more to get the same relaxing reaction that you had for the first day. So if you feel there's too much in it, turn on those taps, let out some of that stuff in a healthy way. Don't resort to drugs or alcohol or habits, snacking, things that aren't so good for you. Think of the positives and think about how you can do this going forward. We talked, didn't we, about resilience and what that looks like. And we're going to use an adaptation here, the Robertson Cooper model. I always want to say Robinson Crusoe and imagine I'm on an island, but right now I guess it feels like that for many people because we do feel a bit deserted, I suspect. So if you imagine that circle in the middle is you, and that's you with all the things that have happened to you, good, bad, and indifferent. And we learn from things. We learn perhaps if our relationship has broken down. How did we get better from that? What did we have to do to recover? How did we manage it? So it doesn't all have to be terribly traumatic. Resilience is life. Resilience is how we build up from things that have happened to us or around us that could have an emotional impact. So for many, we look at that sense of purpose. And I think that might change with age and stage. So for example, when you're younger, you might want to do well at school, you might want to go on to higher further education, you might want to get a good job, promotion, you might want a partner, a family, a home, all of those things. Then you get to the middle stages where perhaps some people have those things. And you get to that stage and you're thinking, what next? What do I need to do next? And all of those previous things have built your relationship and built your resilience. And so think now in the middle time, what is your purpose now? What is your purpose now, perhaps during lockdown? How are things going to be different? And then you get to the older spectrum where perhaps people are coming up to retirement, which of course isn't really old, but we look at it in that way, don't we? And think, what would your purpose be? Now, it could be that something has happened along the way that means your purposefulness is different. You may not be striving to achieve a massive amount in the workplace. You might just be steadily getting on with it. Yeah, it could be you've had a traumatic incident during your lifespan, which could be a close bereavement. And that might be, as some people describe it, a wake-up call. And that's going to change people's sense of purposefulness. So people might say, well, actually, I want to spend more time with my grandchildren. I want to take up an art class. I want to do more for myself. I want to do yoga, all sorts of things. Our purposefulness is going to have changed. But we need to remember that in terms of our resilience. We need to keep both going, really. Then we look at adaptability. A lot of resilience is based on that. The more resilient we are, the more able we are to adapt. So, for example, the lockdown. As I've said, many people have had to adapt to new ways of working. Many people have had to cope with not going out for 12 weeks. Many of people have been removed from their family and friends and their work colleagues. So we have to adapt. And this time we had to adapt very quickly. And the more resilient you are, the easier it is to adapt. The more you're able to manage change, the easier it is to adapt. And then we look at confidence, and there's no age and stage to confidence, really. You have very young, confident people and older, confident people, but that confidence grows from your resilience. So, for example, if you did something at work, perhaps a presentation that went really well, and people have said, you did a great job there, that's going to grow your confidence. So next time you go into it, you're not fearful. You think, well, it went okay last time, it should go okay this time. But what if that first time it didn't go well? And you felt, oh, I've done a terrible job of that. If you're not quite a resilient person, person, you may think, I can never do another presentation because it's going to go so badly. And I think we have to hope that our resilience is good enough to hold us up. And then we come to the final one there, social support. And we know, don't we, that in terms of mental health and well-being, social support is key to maintaining our mental health. Social support may change over years. You have school friends, you have university friends, you have couples friends, you have all sorts of friends. And how do you keep in touch with them? What do you do? The lockdown has been isolating for many. How much social support have you had, and how are you coping with that? What are you doing with your friends online? How are you managing that? All of that feeds and builds your resilience. So very quickly recap, resilience is a thing that's happened to us along the way and how we've recovered from that. So it's not just the things that have happened, but how we've picked ourselves up. The purposefulness, keep checking, what's my sense of purpose here? How adaptable am I to all of the things that are going on around me? And what's my confidence level like? How easy is that confidence to be knocked? And the final one on there, of course, is a social support. So we've looked briefly at stress, we've looked briefly at resilience. We're going to move on now to mental health. So, mental health, what does it look like? Mental illness, what does it look like? Is there a difference? Is there a difference between mental health and mental illness? Well, I reckon there is. Mental health is our day-to-day well-being, the things that happen to us on a day-to-day life that can affect the way we think and feel. So you might have had a marvelous morning at work doing the things you have to do. You have a meeting that's a bit tricky and you think, oh no, that's awful. And it starts to affect our mental health. You go home, perhaps you have, or you're at home, perhaps you have an argument with your partner, and that affects our mental health still further. So our mental health is like a barometer. It's day to day changing, depending on the good things or the not so good things that are happening to us. Mental illness is something quite different. Mental illness needs to be diagnosed by a medical practitioner. A counsellor is not going to diagnose it for you. You have to see a doctor or a psychiatrist. They will make a diagnosis of that illness. So looking again at the differences are mental health, mood and sense of well-being do not remain constant. They change as you move through stages of your life. A mental illness is defined as a health condition that changes a person's thinking, feeling, or behaviour, or all three. And that causes the person distress and sometimes difficulty in functioning. So the next thing I think is about the knowledge that we have about mental illness, because it's so surrounded, isn't it, by stigma and discrimination and all of those sorts of things. People are frightened to talk about it. So where do we get our knowledge from? So think of the average person who reads newspapers. What sort of newspapers do you read? What sort of things do you see in those newspapers that inform you about mental health? Mental illness. Now, some of them sensationalize and demonize mental illness. They will say things like schizophrenic went on to kill, psychopath killed neighbor, and they're all headlines, aren't they? And the reality is people with mental illnesses are far more likely to harm themselves than you. That said, one still has to go cautiously, but newspapers don't tend to talk positively in the main about mental illness. They talk more about it demonized way, or they sensationalize it. And then we have TV. And this is where we break the bad news that Emmerdale, Coronation Street, and EastEnders are not real. But for many people who watch them, they think that's what a mental illness is like. So, for example, the storyline of bipolar disorder in EastEnders, many people thought that was an accurate portrayal of it. Now, they did a pretty good job, but there's far more to it than that. So I think, again, be mindful of the sort of TV that informs around mental illness. There's lots of stuff on now around me and my mental illness, my mind and me, all very positive things that you can look at to get a professional slant on what it is. There's personal knowledge. I think, as I said earlier, we have 700 people interested in this webinar today. Of the 700 of you out there, how many of you have personal knowledge of a mental illness? Maybe for yourself, maybe for a family member, or maybe you're living with someone that lives with a mental illness on a daily basis. We have media sources such as the radio, and we have films. Now, you will all probably remember One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, an iconic film back in the day. and also things like Shutter Island. They're all films that talk about and portray mental illness. And I guess that in the main is where we get our knowledge from. Some of it is very circumspect, so I think we have to be cautious and be aware of, not everything that we read or see is necessarily the truth. But it does put it out there. It does make people more aware of it. So one of the things people talk about when they're struggling perhaps with a mental illness, when they've got a poor level of resilience, and when they're feeling overwhelmed and stressed, there's a major factor in having those difficulties is a loss of control. I feel I can't do anything. And those who usually cope well are the people that others tend to lean on. Are you one of those people? So going forward, perhaps consider issues that you've wrestled with in the past and that you dealt with the past, and ask yourself what worked for you and what resources did you use? Because we're all incredibly resourceful if we allow ourselves to be. We're all also incredibly resilient if we let ourselves be and not go into panic mode and say that we're stressed about everything. So if you had an issue, what would stop you asking your manager for support if you needed some temporary consideration about any difficulty you may be experiencing? I ran the webinar on Monday and I asked the question in there. I think most of us would have no problem at all in phoning our manager and saying, look, I'm really poorly today. I have a really bad headache, or I have flu, a really bad cold, cough. I'm really not able to work today. I think most people would feel quite confident in talking about that with their manager. But what if you woke one morning and you felt very depressed or very anxious, or you're living with mental illness, and you wanted to say to your manager you didn't feel fit enough to work? How many of us would have the confidence to do that, I wonder? And what would you say? I think it's just a question that perhaps we need to consider. But in noticing the difference, we've made the differential between physical and mental health. And what we want to do, what the purpose of Mental Health Week is to actually put physical and mental illnesses on a par, so that we'd have no problem picking up our phone and saying to the manager, look, I suffer with anxiety and I'm having a really, really bad day. I don't think I would be particularly productive today. What would stop us doing that? Try and think about mental illness on a par with a physical illness. And when we do that, we begin to stop the discrimination and stigma that goes around it, or if not stop it, certainly make inroads into that. So we look at the 5 ways of well-being, and we all know what they are. We look at connect, be active, take notice, learn, and give. And they're 5 brilliant things to consider during this week, particularly as the theme is kindness, but also in terms of our mental health and well-being. Connect with people. It's a really good thing to do. Be active. What do you do in terms of your activity during lockdown? Take notice of things around you. I certainly have heard people say, and I've certainly noticed for myself during lockdown, I don't think I've ever heard the birds sing so loudly. Now, when I was busy and when I was under pressure, traveling here, there and everywhere, and so busy I didn't get time to step out during the daytime, I didn't notice those things. But now I do. I'm taking notice. Learn, do a course. This is a brilliant time to start thinking about that. Lots of courses online at the moment that are free that you can tack into and have a look and see what's going on. And give support, give help, give kindness. Be kind to people. Think about all those things in terms of your own mental health and well-being. So we're going to just finish the bulk of the presentation now with this. So I'm going to close with this before we go to the slides about care first and then on to the questions. So ask yourself these questions as we go through them. Where and who do you take your support from? Who are the people that support me at work? Name them in your head. Who might they be? Who are the people that support you at home or in your group of friends? Where do you go that gives you a sense of security? Now, I know that's a bit of a difficult question at the moment, but some people can imagine, I'd like to go and sit on a beach, or I'd like to walk in the woods. I feel safe and secure there. Think about those things. And now in terms of resilience, what are the skills and competencies you have that assist you to cope? What are those? Do you have a good sense of humour? Are you passionate about your work? What skills do you have? And the final one, the self-affirmation one, what do you know about yourself that's going to get you through whatever this difficult situation may be? So think about that again. Where do I get support from? Work and home. Where do I go that I feel safe and secure? What skills and competencies do I have? And what do I know about myself or tell myself that's going to get me through? You have 24 access to Care First. You will go through to a qualified counsellor who will offer in the moment support with you. You will have an assessment at some point to say, how is this issue that you're phoning about affect your work? You can contract to work with a telephone counsellor. You could, prior to lockdown, have face-to-face counselling. There's the information service. There's management, consultancy and advice. There's immediate information and advice for all sorts of concerns, which is provided by our Care First information specialists, who are all CAB trained. Many talk to us about money issues, debt, consumer issues, benefits, employment matters, and elder care and even childcare issues. Our information specialists are really good at helping and supporting people with those types of issues. You can also log on to Care First Lifestyle, and you will see there the circles, and that's that you can use the drop-down boxes to look at things about home or work. There's awareness dates, there's a set of webinars, there's a click to be connected to a counsellor, you can do that. There's also a budget calculator on there. There's a stress questionnaire and an alcohol questionnaire, and you can look on your lifestyle site and see all of these things. So look on your electronic or your paper pamphlets about Care First and get the number that you need to phone us. The number isn't on there because I know I'm addressing more than one customer, and customers have their own Care First free phone number. So check with what you have. There's also the lifestyle site, which I've just shown you, which is practical information and support and advice, and the Zest site, which is the health and well-being site. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Chi here to help with some of the questions. So if you hear me chatting to Chi, it's just us trying to get this right. Chi, I'm going to hand you over now as a presenter, okay?
Okay, thank you, Pat.
Well, I say I am. We're going to try this, huh? Okay, guys, you know I said to you about being resilient and not worrying about things. Well, we're just having a moment's hiccup here as we try to do this. Bear with me. If you can think of your questions and perhaps start typing them, that would be really useful. Are you there, Chi? I'm just trying to get you into this.
Yeah, don't panic.
I'm not panicking.
Is your questions pane up?
Yes, it is. Okay, I'm going to click on that, guys. Let's see what happens, huh? Ah, brilliant. Okay, there's some great questions here already. Chi, can you see them?
I can't, no.
Okay, well, I can actually read some of these. I don't seem to have many here, which is quite, oh no, hang on, I haven't gone down to the bottom of the page yet. Just general ones like, has it started? Yes, obviously it has. And I've got a lovely one here that has said, when I asked the question of how would it be for you, what image, someone said it would be like a tree in a very windy situation. So to me, it would be a branch under a lot of strain. So drawing this, I think that's a brilliant question. Thank you. I like that one. Let's have a look at the next one down here, see what we have. Okay. What techniques would you recommend to deal with stress? I think you're right. The word stress is overused. Okay. So I don't really know what I would say. I would say, to be very clear about stress being the emotional manifestation of something that's gone quite wrong and that you've been so pressured for so long, you're at the point of bending, breaking or cracking. I don't know whether that's the right sort of answer, but that's the answer I'm giving right now. Obviously, you can email again and we can think about this a bit more. But I do think, yeah, the word does tend to be overused. Let's look what else we've got here. Okay. What do you do if someone is putting you under stress? Concerning calling into work to say you can't come in with a mental illness. Okay, this is someone who's very bravely said that they've experienced that, exactly as we said, you know, it's better to fight through this feeling and still go to work, you know, or are we treating this as a physical illness? Thank you for that. Yeah, I do think we have to start thinking about mental health in terms of mental health and physical health on the same level. As I said, you wouldn't think twice about phoning in about a migraine, but you would think twice perhaps about phoning in if you've got a mental illness. So those of you who can do that, and for this particular person, thank you so much for saying that, because yes, very brave. Do feel that you can phone in, and managers have a duty of care for you, and so really they need to hear those things if possible. Okay, some people here are talking about sleep. People are talking about vivid dreams and all sorts of things like that. Do you have any advice? Yeah, okay. Obviously, this is personal advice. I don't know how helpful this is, but I am a mental health first aid instructor. So we can, I guess, talk about this for a few minutes. I think sometimes when we go to sleep with too much on our mind. I don't know whether this person that's asked the question is a list maker, but if you are, sometimes it's really helpful to make a list before you go to bed and dump all that stuff on a piece of paper so that you can try to put it behind you. Also, things like not watching the news late at night, because that can also impact you if it's bad news. You remember when you're anyone out there with children or are mindful of having little ones around, we all have a great sleep routine for kids, don't we? We tend to give them a bath, we tend to give them a warm drink, and we read them a story and pop themselves into bed. But grown-ups, we don't do that, do we? We're rushing around, getting things ready for the next day, and we don't get our mind running down before we get into bed. So perhaps try and think about that and see how you can do that. Yeah, there's someone here talking about mental health being a bit of a suspicion around it, that people sometimes don't believe that it's real. Mental health and mental illness is a very real thing, and it can impact people as much as, and in some cases more, than a physical illness. So I think we all need to be aware of that. Do you have to ring? Can you have counselling online? Yeah, in the first instance, do you try to phone Care First on your 0800 number? If that really fills you with fear and terror, you can go onto the lifestyle site, and there is a little bit there on the right-hand side of the page as you look at it that says click here to be connected to a counsellor. You can do that, but priority is given to those people who can phone in at the time. So if you could be brave enough just to phone that number, you will go through to a qualified counsellor, and they would be waiting for your call. And I think you would probably be able to speak to them quite straightforwardly. Do give it a go. And if you are struggling, email us and we see what we can do to help you. Would our employer be notified, or can we receive confidential advice? You can absolutely receive confidential advice and counselling. The only time any confidentiality is breached is in the instance where there might be a risk of life or threat of harm to an individual, an older person or child protection issue, vulnerable adult or child protection issue, or a risk of security to the organisation. Other than that, it's completely confidential. Will a copy of the recording be available? Yes, it will. There will be a copy of the recording available, and I will email you personally if you want to email me about that question. Lots of interesting comments here about being right, about trying to face my fears, and trying to think about coming into work when people are feeling mentally unwell. So for you, the person who's asked this question, well done for doing that. And in this case, treating it like a physical illness isn't necessarily the best option. For you, that isn't the case, and I absolutely respect that. For many, it is. So I think, again, it's a bit like stress. It's different to everybody. What are the effective ways to detach from work while working from home? Yeah, that's really difficult. If you're working in a house and you have children dashing around, or animals interrupting you, or things going on around you, it's really difficult. I think what I personally try to do is move myself away from wherever there's anything in the house. I set myself a routine just as I would for work. I get up, I do my normal routine as if I were going to work before I sit in front of my keyboard. I make sure I take my, I make sure I take my breaks. I'm trying to make sure I take my breaks. And I try to leave work at 5 o'clock and shut everything down so I'm not actually looking at it. And I think, you've said here you're finding it hard to put thoughts and challenges from your working day aside. I think really because it's all around us, that's much more difficult now. And I think we all find ways of dealing with it. So thank you for that question. It is hard to put thoughts and challenges from the working day aside. And it sounds as though you are doing that. Again, if you're a list maker, try doing that. That might help. I'm mindful we have so many questions here and we're just not going to get through them all. Do you mind, guys, if I just flick through and see? All of them are helpful. All of them are really helpful. Yeah, okay. There's a really good one here. Please can I ask if you have suggestions of other ways to manage stress? How do you support someone who may be experiencing aspects of mental health? They find it hard to get started in the day and making decisions. Yeah, as I said earlier in that slide, if you're feeling overwhelmed, it's really difficult to make a decision. And I think we have to respect that that is the case. I guess one of the things I personally would say is try and do things on a smaller scale. So instead of setting out like I've got all these massive things to do today, just try and make a list of what you think or what this person may think is doable within the day. If you set the bar too high, people are going to feel they're failed. So I do think, you know, be aware of that. Instead of saying we need X, Y, and Z, get it much smaller. Let's try and achieve this by this time. And if you've got a mental illness and you're living with a mental illness, it's really difficult to get started some days. Things like depression, anxiety can sit on you like a great weight, and you think, do you know what, I actually can't get out of bed, I can't do things. So helping and supporting that individual would be a way forward with that one. How can you help people who suffer from stress or anxiety, or both? Yeah, again, this is an absolutely brilliant question, and we're so pushed for time. Answering it very briefly, what techniques do you find useful? I think if you're helping a friend, it's important that you help yourself first. So make sure that you're physically and emotionally able to manage whatever it is your friend may say, because sometimes it's really draining to be the friend or to be the support of someone who's struggling with their well-being, with their mental health, with any sort of health issue. It's really difficult for the supporter. So I think for you, maybe try and get your boundaries in place, like times when you can talk to this person, time when you're free to talk. You know, don't say you can phone me at any time and then they phone you at 3 in the morning. That isn't particularly helpful for you. So just think about how you might do that. Do I have strategies on how not to overthink things? I'm smiling at that one because actually I think I overthink things myself. So I think it's about talking openly with your manager and saying, you know, I've got this thing, I tend to overthink things. Tell me exactly what it is the expectation is for me to do this. And let's see if we can work for that. And I think sometimes that helps if the manager is supportive and can help you with it. Or perhaps if you've got a mental health first aider in your organisation, you can talk to them about this and see if they can offer you some help and support about that. As an overthinker myself, I have to set myself deadlines and guidelines and work to those, because otherwise I would be working probably all day and not taking a break. So yeah, I would do that. Talk to people if you can. Yeah. There are more brilliant questions here. Chi, can you hear me? No. Okay, yeah. You can't. Oh, you can. Yeah, I've got so many questions here. People have been really, really brilliant. I just can't go through them all. Do we save these questions? Can we save them and
yeah, so I think what might be useful is if any of the questions people have written haven't been answered, they will receive an email quite shortly, an automated email which they can respond to, and they can send the question by email that way, and you can respond back to them when you're ready.
Yeah, do you all get that? Thank you, Chi. That I'd completely forgotten that. I'd love to answer them all personally now, but obviously I'm not going to be able to do that, and we're going to have to call the webinar to a halt. I really, really hope that you found it useful today. Please remember that stress is different for everybody. Remember that we are very, very resilient. I don't want you to think that everyone who's going to come out of this pandemic is going to be hit with a mental illness. That is not the case. Some people have thrived in this. Some people have struggled in this, and there's no right and wrong. So I think the advice for the very end is to do something for yourself that's good, healthy, and helpful. and take care of yourselves. And thank you so much for joining the webinar today. Thanks for that. Bye now.